Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is a press conference on human rights in COP21. My name is Craig Mokhiber. I am with the United Nations Human Rights Office, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm joined here at the podium by two of our independent United Nations human rights experts, Mr. John Knox, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and to my right, Ms. Tauli-Corpuz, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Both very active participants in the conference here in Paris, longtime human rights defenders who are engaging in the process to make sure that the outcome of this conference pays due attention to the impacts of climate change and the impacts of the preferred responses to climate change on internationally guaranteed human rights. I'm just going to say a few words about the struggle that's going on around these issues. We have begun here with a recognition of the truism that climate change has very direct negative impacts on a broad range of internationally guaranteed human rights. Human rights like the right to food, the right to housing, the right to water and sanitation, even for people living on small island developing states and in coastal communities, the right to self-determination, and for thousands of people around the world already, the right to life itself. So for that reason, there has been a decided push on the part of civil society organizations, international human rights defenders, and others to make sure that what's agreed here in Paris gives due attention to internationally protected human rights, to make sure that its impact on frontline communities like Indigenous peoples and women and girls, minorities and migrants, small farmers, and a range of other actors on the ground are given the attention that they deserve. To make sure that when we look at issues of adaptation and the climate response and mitigation, that those measures are designed in a way that fully respects and advances these internationally protected human rights, and to make sure that the goals that are set here in Paris are goals that take account of those human rights. So, for example, to make sure that a ceiling is set of not over 1.5 degrees, because we know that higher than that temperature will have very significant impacts on the human rights of real people on the ground. To make sure that adequate climate finance is mobilized so that implementation can take place universally. To make sure, and here's a very challenged piece of all of this, that the human rights language, which currently is in Article 2 on the purposes of the agreement, is in fact retained, is not watered down, and survives the final push of negotiations happening as we speak in these halls today. And to make sure that some of these frontline and vulnerable focus groups that I mentioned earlier are not simply relegated to the preamble as a point of principle, but are included in the operative portions of the agreement being hammered out here in Paris. Every one of these points is under threat at the moment in the negotiations. Every one of them has seen some very principled defense by key member states and others participating in the conference here, but every one of them remains challenged and bracketed, and we're here to urge delegations to please do the right thing here in Paris. It is an interesting coincidence that today is also International Human Rights Day. Human Rights Day started here in Paris with the adoption in Paris of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's only appropriate that as the member states of the United Nations convene here to agree a climate agreement, that they remember that they came into these halls with a commitment to international human rights and that they do nothing to undercut those human rights in this agreement, that in fact what they agree advances those human rights. So as I say, here to say a few words about this subject and to answer your questions, in addition to myself, are our Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights and the Environment and our Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Let me now give the floor for a few words to John Knox, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. John.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you all for being here. As Craig said, I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. That means that the Human Rights Council, the principal intergovernmental body at the United Nations, gave me a mandate to examine the application of human rights law to environmental issues generally, certainly including climate change in particular. I have a pretty simple message, really, and that message is that on Human Rights Day in particular, but on every day, it's important to recognize how climate change interferes with the enjoyment of a vast range of human rights. Paris, it's not up to Paris today, this agreement, to decide whether there's a relationship between human rights and climate change. There is a relationship between human rights and climate change. Paris can't decide or do anything about pretending that that relationship doesn't exist. What it can do is recognize that the relationship does exist and do something about it. Every state in these negotiations belongs to at least one human rights treaty. Most belong to many more than one. Those human rights treaties require them to take steps to protect the rights that those treaties recognize. And that includes protecting them against harms from environmental degradation, including climate change. That means that they must ensure that their climate change actions meet their human rights obligations. There's no longer, I think, any doubt that climate change does interfere with human rights. And in particular, I and several of my colleagues did a report last summer showing that even the incremental increase from a 1.5 to a 2-degree target involves drastic effects on a wide range of human rights. Therefore, I think it's clear, and many governments here have been making the case, that in order to fulfill their human rights obligations, governments should be pursuing the lowest possible target, which means a 1.5 instead of a 2-degree target, and should recognize that in the text. In addition, however, to mitigation requirements, human rights law also applies to adaptation and response measures generally. And the Paris Agreement should recognize that as well, with a strong reference to human rights in Article 2 of the text. I can say more about this, but I think I'll just close with one final thought before I hand this over to Vicki. I just want to emphasize again that this issue is going to continue beyond Paris. Decisions about adaptation, about finance, about mitigation, all of those types of decisions will continue for long after Paris is behind us. What Paris can do is provide a strong statement that allows us, when we go forward, to look back at Paris and have an anchor for the future decisions that will have to be made on issues like finance, adaptation, and mitigation, and so forth. Personally, I am in the process of preparing a report on human rights and climate change to the Human Rights Council, which I'll present in March. I should also note that the United Nations Environment Program just released a major report on human rights and climate change today, which is available, I think, as of this moment on their website. And many others around the world are examining this issue as well. The Philippines Human Rights Commission, to give just one more example, recently announced that it's going to investigate a complaint against 50 major carbon emitters that they violated the human rights of people in the Philippines by continuing to emit carbon, even though that they knew over time that there were human rights, that there were major consequences, including for human rights. I just want to close with this thought. As Craig says, this is the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Rights here in Paris in 1948, 67 years ago. We look back at the people who made those decisions with admiration and respect and gratitude. In 2082, how will the people alive then look back at the decisions that are being made now? Will they share the feelings that we have now towards the drafters of the Universal Declaration? Will they think, thank goodness that they took the measures they did in Paris in 2015? I think that's what we should be asking ourselves and aspiring towards. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Perfect litmus test for judging the outcome of this conference and for driving us until the very last minute to make sure we get the outcome that we need for the Earth and for human rights. Let me now give the floor to Vicki Tauli-Corpuz, who, as I said, is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who's been here not just bringing Indigenous peoples' issues into the forum, but trying to make sure that the voice of Indigenous peoples participate as well. Vicki.
Thank you very much, Craig. Today is International Human Rights Day, and I think one of the main messages that Indigenous peoples are wanting to express to the parties to this convention is to say that the human rights in general and indigenous people's rights in particular should not be traded away here in Paris. So indigenous peoples have participated actively here in the climate change conventions, and also in the Human Rights Council, which has come up with 4 resolutions linking human rights and climate change. And this is the reason why in Cancun, there were very strong references to the need to respect human rights in all climate change actions. And this was in 2011. Now we come here to Paris, and we can see that the negotiators maybe have forgotten the Cancun decisions, and now we are starting all over again. And I think that the text as it stands now is still very weak because it has the preambular paragraph 10 and the paragraph in 2.2, but in the rest of the document, you can hardly see any references to human rights anymore. There are references to the need to use and promote indigenous people's traditional knowledge, and of course, I think there's a small part which talks about participation, but the basic right to participate by non-parties is really something that we should push for very strongly here in the Paris Agreement, because it's not just states who are going to solve the problem. It's really the peoples, we the peoples of the United Nations, who are going to solve the problem of the climate crisis. And indigenous peoples in particular have always said that, we have contributed a lot to minimizing, the climate change impacts, because we have saved our forest, we have managed our ecosystems very well, and we live very simple lives. We don't overconsume and overproduce, and therefore, as a stakeholder in this whole decision, in this whole process, their contributions as well as the adverse impacts on them should really be addressed. Should be at the center of the discussions. And it was mentioned that we are talking here about people. If climate change is human-induced, then it's people who are really going to suffer, but they are also the ones who will provide the solutions. And I would just like to mention that there have been many evidences already which emerge from researches done by indigenous peoples, academics, and NGOs, and the UN as well, which show the direct link of when human rights are protected and respected, then climate change mitigation is achieved. One example of this was the research done by the World Resources Institute and the Rights and Resources Initiative, which shows that in communities, 513 million hectares of forests in 14 countries, which include Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, they have shown that in these countries, where the rights of indigenous peoples are protected to be able to manage and control their forests, they managed to keep 37.1 billion tons of carbon in the ground. And I think, but in the areas where the rights are not protected, like for instance in Brazil, the indigenous peoples will show that 11% they have mitigated, they keep 11% of the carbon, which is much higher than the forests that are managed by the state. So I think this is really one example of where the direct link is between human rights and the effectivity in terms of providing solutions for climate change. Lastly, I would just like to say that in this context, indigenous peoples are really strongly urging the states here in Paris to really include human rights in Article 2.2 and also include the need to respect human rights, in particular indigenous people's rights, in the adaptation, mitigation, capacity building, and technology transfer in development, as well as finance. That's precisely why we indigenous peoples want to find it in Article 2.2, because by having that there, then it will flow into the other areas which are all being decided today. Thank you very much.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed, first for emphasizing that role of indigenous peoples as a frontline community in the struggle against climate change, not just in being victimized by bad climate policy, but also in teaching us about sustainable approaches that we so desperately need, it seems to me, but also for underscoring this principle of participation. I just want to make this point as well, that participation is, a central principle of international human rights. And in this conference, participation is equally important. That means participation, the presence of civil society in the negotiations themselves. It means the right to peaceful protest by civil society representatives outside the conference. It means the broadest possible participation by the thousands of human rights defenders and climate activists and women's representatives, Indigenous peoples, and others who have come to Paris to try to get the strongest possible agreement. So that's a human rights principle, I think, worthwhile remembering that on this Human Rights Day. 1.5 degrees to avoid human rights harms, adequate climate finance, strong human rights language in Article 2, and making sure that these groups that we've been mentioning, including Indigenous peoples, are included in the operative part of the text. So essential to getting the kind of outcome that we expect from Paris, the birthplace of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With that, let me open up the floor for your questions. I will tell you there are microphones on both sides of the room, so when I acknowledge you, please do wait for the microphone to come to you. Identify yourself, your affiliation, and pose your question. I have a question here in the front row, and the microphone is on its way.
Joan Stevenson from the Watershed Sentinel. I'm wondering if the reluctance to adopt the Declaration of the Indigenous People Rights and the reluctance to ratify the Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights has affected the decision in opposing this section from being these important human rights respected in Article 2.
Okay. Why don't we take that question first? Vicky and then John.
Well, I think that there is really a disconnect between the people who are working in the who work in the Human Rights Council, the negotiators who are there or the parties who are there, and the ones who are doing the climate change negotiations. And I think there is a lack of better coordination between these different bodies, and therefore the internationally recognized human rights standards and instruments are not really communicated very well to the negotiators here in Paris. So I think that's one reason. But the other reason is, of course, asserting human rights really is something that's not very easy to put in the text, because as we all know, many states are still not complying with their obligations to international human rights conventions.
John.
I think Vicky said most of what I was thinking. Just very briefly, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, of course, does have over 160 state parties. So if you're referring to the United States in particular, which has signed but not ratified it, the United States, I think, has seen no trouble joining consensus in all of the resolutions before the Human Rights Council that Vicky referred to, all of which do describe a strong relationship between human rights and climate change. So I don't really want to speculate about which countries are having trouble with which provisions in the text. I just think it's important for all of the countries to come together and reach agreement on this.
Yeah, let me just add to that every country in the world has ratified at least one United Nations human rights treaty, one of the core treaties, and most of them have ratified more than 4. And as John said, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, over 160 parties. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, over 160 parties. Convention on the Rights of the Child, all countries in the world except one. And so it is across the board. And secondly, because this is Human Rights Day, to mention that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies to all countries. So these are pre-existing obligations in international human rights law that apply to all member states and can't be avoided by sidestepping those obligations in subsequent international agreements. Let's see if there are other questions now from the floor. I think we're still on this side of the room, close to the microphone. Yes.
My name is Megan Rowling. I work for Thomson Reuters. I'm just wondering...
I don't think we're... Yes, please.
Yeah, you can hear me. Some states definitely seem nervous about having human rights in the operative part of the text, partly, I think, because they don't know fully what it would mean for their actions that they need to carry out for mitigation, adaptation, etc. What would you say to reassure them that this isn't going to obstruct their efforts? And can you just explain really what is the difference between having it in the preamble and having it in the operative part of the text in a practical sense?
Yeah. John, maybe you start on this, and then Vicky.
Sure. So to answer the questions in order, what I would say is that your human rights obligations apply whether or not the Paris Agreement specifically refers to them. Whatever those obligations are not going to be changed in substance as a result of a clear reference to them in the Paris Agreement, which might raise the second question, well, then why include them? What difference does it make? It's not that it changes the substantive nature of the obligations. What it does is make it clearer that there's a basis for further discussions in the context of the climate regime that are going to be taking place over the coming months and years, that those discussions need to take place in light of human rights obligations and on the basis of respect for human rights. Now, could those discussions take place, and should they take place anyway on the basis of respect for human rights? Of course they should. But sending a clear signal at this high level, at the high level of the Paris Agreement, to future discussions that are going to be taking place at future COPs, at future intersessional meetings, at meetings of financing mechanisms, all through the climate change, all through the climate regime, I think is quite useful and practically important.
Thanks. Vicky.
Yes. Well, I think that we can tell the states that, by respecting human rights, you are maximizing the benefits of climate change mitigation and enhancing the capacities of very vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change, but you will also minimize the risks. We can see now that in many situations where climate change impacts have really created more poverty, food insecurity, and hunger, as well as deprived, for instance, indigenous peoples of their rights to lands and territories. This now has created a lot of conflicts in many indigenous territories and other territories, and now there are, in fact, even indigenous peoples who are wanting to pursue and sustain their efforts to provide solutions. They are even criminalized. I have spoken to several indigenous representatives who are here who are fearing that when they go back home, they might be arrested because of the record of fighting for their land rights. So I think that's really the issue that's facing us as we speak of human rights here in climate change. And so we really need to convince the states that this is the most, how do you call it? It's the most moral thing to do, and they are legally obliged to implement and comply with their human rights obligations anyhow.
John, I just sort of add to that, that this is really also a due diligence argument. It's making sure that you have an agreement that takes account of the reality of people's internationally guaranteed human rights and the obligations that go along with them, so that when you adopt measures for adaptation, mitigation, climate response, you adopt measures that don't undercut people's human rights, that advance them. And secondly, it sends a very clear signal that what the purpose of the agreement, to quote Article 2, is actually, in addition to making sure that the planet is healthy, to making sure that the well-being of human beings, that this is about people. It's not in the first instance about governments or regions or corporations, but that the purpose is to make sure that the well-being of people in current and in future generations is actually protected. And that's a different approach. And the last thing I'll say about this is this issue of policy coherence. If you operate in silos with an agreement on human rights here and an agreement on development there and trade over here and climate over there, you often end up with a situation where those things are operating against each other, at odds at each other. That's an efficiency argument as well. So this move toward policy coherence that we saw reflected so well in the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals just this year is a trend that needs to continue to make sure that we make progress with the speed and all due deliberation that we need to. Other questions? Yes, let's shift over to this side now. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Thomas Asravi from Danish media Globalnyt, and you didn't mention loss and damage, and I want to ask if there's any connection between loss and damage and human rights, and if you have any messages for loss and damage in the agreement. Thank you.
John, you want to take this? Yeah.
So certainly a fundamental principle of human rights law is that states are under an obligation to provide effective remedies for violations of human rights. So, without prejudging what that would mean specifically in the climate context, I do think it's important that the agreement include a strong commitment to continue to talk about loss and damage through a mechanism that would allow decisions to be made going forward. I mean, in this respect, as in others, Paris is not the final word. It's simply an important statement along the path of future negotiations. But certainly human rights should infuse the discussions of loss and damage, just as it should inform the discussions of every other aspect of climate action.
Thanks, John. Vicky.
Yes, loss and damage is really a key issue that should be addressed here, precisely because the adverse impacts on communities and states and peoples who will not be able to adapt anymore but have to move away from where they are is really an issue that has to be dealt with. And so what are the human rights of peoples who have to leave their islands because these islands have sunk? What compensation or remedies will be given to them so that they will really enjoy their rights to be able to live in dignity and with well-being? So I think that there has to be a strong loss and damage international mechanism agreed upon, and of course the risks that these people face should also be dealt with.
Thank you, Vicky. And after all, at the center of this is this idea of climate justice as well, which is so closely linked to human rights. I mean, we know now that climate change is not an accident of nature, but it's the result of specific policies and practices and actions in the public and the private sector. Somebody did something that harmed somebody else. And that notion of justice needs to be recognized to address issues of remedies that John has mentioned. We've got about just under 5 minutes left. Let's take another one from this side of the room. Yes.
I'm Dorit Seitz from Politiken, Denmark. 2 questions. Could you be more specific what exactly has changed in the text with this new draft from yesterday? Where do you see the most severe issues? And the second question is the whole red area, forestry, seems to be one area where really there's a lot of impact that could be very positive or it could be very negative for human rights, indigenous peoples. Could you talk a little about where you see the text on that?
Great. Let's go 1 minute to Vicky and then 1 minute to John so we can get some more questions in. Vicky.
Well, I think that what has changed in the text from where it was before is that Article 2.2 has specifically mentioned including indigenous people's rights, people with disabilities, rights of women, and all that. And that has been removed. Now there is just a word on the need to promote human rights. In terms of the forests, I think that the paragraphs on forest in the text that didn't reiterate the issue of the need to respect safeguards to protect social and environmental standards whenever actions related to forests are being undertaken. But I also take note that in some of the intended nationally determined contributions that the states have given, I've read some of them, like Brazil and Mexico, they have said that they will go for zero deforestation by 2030. And I think that's something that needs to be emulated by others as well.
Thanks, John. Great. Yes, sir. Let's go back to this side of the room, and then we'll come to the left. Yeah.
My question has been answered a lot, but I just want to mention that I was at the Small Island States in the Pacific Conference 2 days ago, and the president of Tuvalu, I think that's his right title, said that 72% of the people in Tuvalu would probably leave the island if nothing happens in the next 5 to 10 years. There is no way they can stay. They're losing their island. It's very small, as you know. But 72% of the people are considering leaving Tuvalu. So what he said is, we are not only losing land, we are losing the right to be. Exactly. That's a profound impact on an entire population.
Yeah, absolutely, and it just shows you how broad is the destructive net of climate change that it even touches on the right to self-determination for people living in small island developing states in particular. John?
I first became involved in this issue 8 years ago when I began doing pro bono work for the government of the Maldives, which is in a similar situation. And I think what you said is absolutely right. I mean, if you can't live on your own territory in your own land, then your ability to enjoy basically your entire spectrum of human rights is compromised severely, if not destroyed. So I think one of the things that a human rights perspective does is shine a light on the most vulnerable people in the world to climate change and say it's not acceptable that a climate policy is struck that leaves these people out, that makes these people have to give up their hope of continuing to enjoy their fundamental human rights that allow them to pursue lives of dignity, of freedom, and equality.
Thanks, John. We're going to try to squeeze one more out here on this side of the room before we conclude. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Samisoni from the Pacific. Following up to the previous question about the report that was released last week by the United Nations University and SCAP on the migration and impact of climate change in the Pacific. There were 3 islands in the Pacific that were surveyed. From the OHCHR's perspective, what do you think needs to happen in order to stop the possible mass migration of Pacific Islanders because of their islands being lost to sea level rise? What needs to happen?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to start by recognizing that the inevitability of this horrific human rights impact. The world is already seeing climate migration, not just from small island states, but also from arid areas and others. I mean, it's this amazing reality that the world has been so slow in reacting to about the way people are compelled to move for purposes of survival and livelihood. The international legal framework around migration, of course, looks at issues of persecution for asylum and refugee status, presuming that that persecution comes directly from one's government or from human beings. Now we've created a situation where the earth itself becomes the persecutor as a result of human activity. So there is no doubt that the international legal framework needs to accommodate compelled migration, whatever its cause. That the current response we're seeing to the migration crisis is not encouraging when it comes to the level of empathy and solidarity of the international community and individual states in receiving people who are compelled to move for various reasons, and we need to make an adjustment there. So that underscores the absolute urgency in addressing the cause of that forced migration, which is, in this case, climate change, of taking very serious measures to make sure that we keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees, to make sure that financing is made available for adaptation and for mitigation, and to deal, of course, with loss and damage as well, and to make sure that we are true to those human rights commitments that were made in the Universal Declaration in 1948 of a social and international order where all human rights can be realized for all of these people. So this is a new human rights issue in recent decades, which has emerged and has now become a part of what is a human rights crisis. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis. It needs to be addressed as such, and we think it needs to start right here in Paris, in these negotiating rooms, with a deal that guarantees strong human rights language in Article 2, a place for groups like Indigenous peoples and other vulnerable communities in the operative part of the text, a commitment to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and a commitment to that $100 billion a year for the next 5 years in climate finance so that we can make sure that human rights are respected in the response to climate change. With that, I think that we've exhausted our time. I thank you all for being with us. Thank you very much.